Rome, 1610. The corridors of the Sant'Ambrogio convent echo with prayers, but behind one of its doors a woman is screaming. Sister Benedetta, once the pride of a noble Roman family, now lies shackled in a pitch-black cell. Her lips are bloodied from the gag, her wrists bruised from iron. She hasn't committed heresy. She hasn't broken her vows. Her only crime was saying no. 3 weeks earlier, a cardinal, sent by the Pope himself, entered the convent for confessions. Benedetta, devout and obedient, knelt before him in the sacred silence. But what followed wasn't prayer, it wasn't penance, it was coercion. A whisper under the cloak of forgiveness, a hand where no hand should be. When she resisted, he warned her, "Confess your disobedience, or you'll burn," she told the abbess. The abbess told no one. 2 days later, she was dragged from her cell and accused of spiritual pride, madness, possession. The Vatican required no evidence, only silence, and Sister Benedetta disappeared behind iron. She would remain there for 7 years. She was not alone. Across Europe, thousands of women, veiled in white, wedded to Christ, were hidden behind cloister walls. Many entered by choice, many more did not. They were born into nobility and handed to God like property. Inside those walls, they were expected to pray, serve, and obey, no matter what came through the door. Some were visited by saints, others by predators. Some found peace, others found terror. But what united them all was this: they could not leave. Because once you became a bride of Christ, you belonged to the church, and in the shadows of that divine marriage, desire, violence, and power festered unchecked. This is the story of the women the church tried to erase, the sacred, the violated, the silenced, and the men who called themselves holy while turning brides of Christ into their concubines. If you enjoy watching and learning about history, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. But it's incredible how we can explore history together from all around the world. Who were the brides of Christ? To understand what was stolen, we first have to understand what was promised. In the eyes of the church, nuns were not just religious women, they were wives of God, sealed in a sacred covenant that mirrored earthly marriage. The ceremony was elaborate: white veils, gold rings, vows recited before the altar. But this wasn't a symbolic gesture. Canon law called it a mystical marriage. These women were, quite literally, considered the brides of Christ. It was beautiful on parchment, but brutal in practice. Once a woman entered a convent, she ceased to exist as a person in the eyes of the law. She could not leave, she could not marry, she could not inherit, she could not testify. Her life was no longer hers. It belonged to the church, and to the men who ran it. But here's what the church didn't preach from the pulpit. Most nuns didn't join by choice. In wealthy families across Renaissance Italy, daughters were divided into 2 fates. The eldest would marry to extend the family's political alliances, the rest locked away. Convents were a place to store excess daughters, women who might threaten inheritance lines or require costly dowries. At age 12, 10, even 8, girls were placed behind the cloister gates and told they were now married to God. Their hair was shaved, their names were changed, some screamed, others prayed. All were expected to obey. To be clear, many women did find meaning in the cloistered life. There were nuns who wrote music, painted, even engaged in theological debates, but these were rare exceptions, not the rule. What most found inside those walls was silence, strict obedience, endless surveillance, and absolute submission to the male hierarchy, confessors, beatides. And while they were called brides of Christ, they had no voice in the marriage. The term itself was weaponized. It wasn't about honoring women's faith, it was about ownership, because in church doctrine, the husband ruled the wife. And if Christ was the husband, then those who spoke for him, priests and popes, became, effectively, their stand-in spouses. This gave men unprecedented access to the female body under the guise of spiritual duty. Confession, discipline, examination, reprimand. And the nun, bound by obedience, had no right to resist. By the 1500s, convents had become both spiritual havens and political prisons. Some were deeply devout, others were hotbeds of exploitation, with confessors using their power to manipulate, seduce, or punish women who could never speak back. Even the word nun began to fracture. Some were cloistered, forbidden to even look out the window. Others lived in semi-open convents but still faced rigid control. Regardless of the type, one thing was constant. Once inside, there was no escape. These were not women with agency, they were assets, traded between God and the church. And in the centuries that followed, many would learn the brutal truth. A bride of Christ was not always protected by the church. She was often owned by it. The Pope's right to possess, they called him the Holy Father, the Vicar of Christ, the man closest to God on earth. But in the dark corners of the Renaissance and Baroque church, some popes were far more flesh than spirit. Officially, popes were celibate, forbidden from sex, marriage, or desire. But behind the Vatican walls, that oath was often little more than a veil. From Pope Alexander VI to Pope Julius III, many kept concubines, fathered children, and held court with mistresses, sometimes even nuns. But the scandal ran deeper than private affairs. The Church had built a system in which spiritual authority granted absolute power, and that power extended into the very hearts of convents, through one sacred, unchallengeable institution: confession. It began in a dark booth, a screen, a whisper, a soul seeking forgiveness. But for the man on the other side, often a priest, bishop, or papal envoy, confession could become something far more sinister: access. Under canon law, confessors had total discretion. A nun was required to speak openly, truthfully, and without resistance. She had to confess everything: her doubts, her desires, her dreams, and he, God's representative, had the power to absolve or punish. This wasn't just spiritual guidance, it was control. If she resisted, that was pride, a sin. If she questioned him, that was disobedience, punishable. If she confessed romantic thoughts, that was lust, to be corrected, perhaps disciplined. The line between holy and horrific blurred fast. In some cases, popes themselves used this system to pursue women, sending trusted envoys to select obedient nuns for private service, claiming spiritual justification. Some were invited to serve in Rome, others were summoned for evaluation. A few were never seen again. Letters from the 16th century show papal officials writing directly to convents, requesting the transfer of certain gifted sisters, women praised for their beauty, their loyalty, or their silence. These weren't spiritual promotions, they were veiled abductions. Perhaps the most notorious example comes from the Sant'Ambrogio convent in Rome, a scandal so explosive it reached the Vatican's highest halls. In 1860, a young noblewoman, Princess Caterina von Hohenlohe, entered the convent seeking peace. What she found was a nightmare. The abbess, Maria Luisa, had been sleeping with the priest assigned as confessor. Young nuns were being drugged, manipulated, and coerced into sexual acts, all under the guise of divine obedience. One nun believed the priest's touch was sacred, another was told resisting him was resisting God. And the Pope, he knew. A secret Vatican tribunal followed, and tried desperately to bury it. This was not an isolated case. Across Italy, Spain, and France, records show similar abuses, confessors using spiritual language to groom, coerce, and consume. And popes, rather than condemn, often looked the other way or quietly reassigned the offenders. Some nuns were silenced, others were excommunicated, blamed for seducing holy men. The priests, most continued their careers. This is where theology became theatre. The Pope, supposedly Christ's representative, stood at the top of a hierarchy built on submission. And the further down you went, the more vulnerable you became, especially if you were a woman, especially if you were a bride of Christ. Because in the eyes of the Church, she belonged not to herself, not to her family, not even to God, but to the institution. And that institution was run by men. Men with power, men with robes, men with needs. The right to possess wasn't written in Scripture. It was carved into silence. Convents of lust and fear, the Church taught that inside convent walls, women were safe. Safe from sin, safe from desire, safe from the world. But what happens when the danger isn't outside, it's inside? In theory, convents were sanctuaries. In reality, they became cages, and sometimes theatres of madness. The outside world saw holiness, white veils, folded hands, the sound of hymns echoing off stone. But behind the iron grates and barred windows, many convents harboured secrets darker than any brothel. Let's go to Milan. The convent of Santa Margherita, cloistered and hidden behind high walls, carried a reputation, not for piety, but for whispers. The nuns inside were known to write strange letters, speak of visions, and confess to sins that left even priests disturbed. One nun, in a confession recorded in 1604, described how she had been touched by 3 priests over the course of a single year. She was told it was training, she was told it was holy. When she resisted, she was starved for 3 days and forced to sleep in the chapel, naked. Another nun attempted to flee, and when caught, was locked in a pitch-black cellar for months. Her crime? Writing to her cousin about what she called the twisted chambers of God's house. And yet, Some convents weren't just abusive, they were decadent. In Venice and Naples, reports surfaced of abbesses wearing jewelry, holding lavish dinners, and secretly entertaining male visitors dressed in clerical robes. Some nuns kept private mirrors, an offense considered heretical. Others had lovers, some pregnancies. The Catholic Church fought hard to suppress these stories. They sent inspectors, reassigned bishops, burned letters. But the truth surfaced, often too late. In France, at the convent of Louviers, hysteria spread in the 17th century. Several nuns claimed they were possessed, but under hypnosis, what emerged wasn't demons, it was trauma. Their visions turned out to be repressed memories of abuse by visiting confessors. The more the church tried to explain these scandals as madness, the more evidence mounted that they were part of something systemic. Because inside many of these convents, desire was not destroyed, it was trapped. Trapped by vows, trapped by silence, trapped by men who controlled salvation. The psychology of these places is almost unbearable to imagine. Young girls, some as young as 10, were sent to live in silence, never to leave, told their bodies were impure, that their thoughts were sinful, that obedience was the only path to heaven. When those same girls were then groomed, touched, or violated by the VE, priests meant to guide them. Who would they tell? Who would believe them? Their words were filtered through confession. Their pain was labelled as penance, their cries, written down. In one convent record from 1672, a bishop writes, "Sister Maria has taken to weeping again. She is troubled by hallucinations and must be restricted from visitors." In the margins, another note. She accuses Father Alonso, possibly fever-induced. She was never heard from again. The veil, once a symbol of devotion, became a mask, hiding not only the face of the nun, but the face of the system. These were not isolated cases. They were symptoms of a structure that combined sexual repression with absolute male authority, and for some women, the only escape was death. Suicide attempts inside convents were so frequent by the 1600s that some church leaders banned ropes and sharp tools from nunneries. In Venice, a nun's body was found floating in the convent cistern. The official report: accidental fall during evening prayer. But the truth was buried, like so many others, beneath hymns and incense. Because the church needed the myth that behind every wall, women lived in holy peace. What it didn't want to admit was the other truth, that in too many of those rooms, women lived in fear, silenced not by faith, but by power. When nuns gave birth, brides of Christ don't have babies. That's what the church insisted, that's what society believed. And yet, across Europe, the impossible kept happening. Infants discovered behind cloister walls, cries heard in the night, then silenced, and bodies, tiny, fragile bodies, found buried beneath chapel floors. This wasn't metaphor, it wasn't myth, it was documented. In 17th century Spain, a sealed report from the convent of Santa Clara described a mysterious illness that left one sister bedridden for days. When the Mother Superior finally entered the cell, she found not a sick woman, but a stillborn child wrapped in a bloodied veil. The nun was publicly stripped of her habits. Branded as a whore, sent to a rural house of penance. No investigation was launched for the priest who had confessed her every week for 3 years. In France, at the Abbey of Fontevraud, multiple infants were unearthed beneath the cloister garden in a 19th century renovation. DNA tests conducted decades later revealed maternal lineage linked to female remains in the nuns' crypts. And again, no male remains, no priests investigated, just quiet reassignment, silent burial, forgotten names. This pattern repeats: Italy, Portugal, Austria. Some nuns who gave birth were quietly relocated to isolated penitential convents where they were forbidden to speak, write, or receive visitors. Others were forced into rejoining the order after childbirth, forbidden to mourn or even acknowledge what had happened. For many, the trauma was lifelong. One testimony in the Vatican's suppressed Liber Notarum recounts a nun's confession. "They told me my sin would be erased if I never spoke of the child. I asked where he was taken. The priest only said, 'God will raise him elsewhere.'" What's more haunting is how normal these tragedies became within the system. Officially, the church claimed miraculous conception was impossible. Unofficially, bishops filed private complaints about scandals in the cloister, requesting hush funds or emergency transfers. A letter from the Bishop of Seville in 1631 reads, "The matter at Santa Marta has been resolved. The sister in question has taken vows of silence. The priest will be moved to the Archdiocese of Cadiz." The problem wasn't the pregnancy, it was the scandal. The male perpetrators, often confessors, priests, or visiting monks, were rarely punished. At most, they were sent to another post, often in a different diocese. Some even reached O's in rank. The shame always was placed on the woman. The burden always fell on the nun. And these weren't isolated women with lovers or scandals of passion. Many of the... Imagine being told by your confessor, the man who speaks for God, that if you refuse him, your soul is in danger. Imagine being locked away at age 12, taught that your only value is obedience, then told that obedience includes submission, and when the child comes, there is no cradle, there is no name, there is only a hole in the floor. The babies born behind convent walls rarely lived long. Disease, starvation, neglect, or worse, deliberate silencing. Some modern scholars believe the infant remains found near certain Spanish nunneries suggest repeated disposal over generations. In one site near Barcelona, archaeologists found 13 infant skeletons buried in irregular rows. None had coffins, all were under 1 year old. Yet the church continued to defend its system, maintaining the illusion of purity while burying the evidence beneath stone, because if the world knew that brides of Christ were giving birth, the myth would die, and with it, the illusion of holy control. Brides turned property. To the outside world, a convent was a sanctuary, a holy retreat, a voluntary calling. But inside the church's ledgers, a nun was not a person, she was an asset. The records didn't list souls, they listed property. And once you entered the cloister, you belonged not to yourself, but to the church, forever. In the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, up to 1 in 3 noble daughters in parts of Italy were sent to convents, not because they were called by faith, but because they were cheaper than marriage. Marriage required a dowry, so did a convent, but the convent's dowry was smaller and came with no political risk. Once a girl was veiled, she could no longer inherit land, she could no longer marry rivals, she was removed from the game of power, locked in a holy vault where her womb and her will were off the table. She was, quite literally, disarmed. At just 8, 10, or 12 years old, many girls took final vows they barely understood. Some were drugged, others were pressured with threats of damnation, a few were chained. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible. Under canon law, a nun could not leave her convent without explicit permission from both her abbess and a bishop, usually male. Any attempt to escape was branded heresy. Some were returned in shackles, others were punished with weeks of isolation, bread and water diets, or forced silence. And yet, these weren't prisons in the traditional sense. They were velvet cages. Beautiful, gilded, spiritual, with painted ceilings, silver chalices, and strict daily rituals. The illusion of holiness masked the reality of incarceration. In economic terms, convents were also profitable. Wealthy families donated land, nobles paid extra for a daughter to have a privileged position, choir mistress, sacristan, even abbess. And when nuns died, their possessions reverted to the church. But more disturbing were the hidden transactions. Some bishops used the term spiritual companionship to mask what was really being negotiated. A nun, gifted or loaned to a higher cleric as comfort, consort, or personal secretary, roles that often came with intimate expectations. Historical documents refer to women being entrusted to cardinals for pastoral support, a euphemism so transparent it barely concealed the truth. In one case from 1492, a Florentine nun named Sister Clarabella was listed in a bishop's personal accounts for new garments and imported perfume. Later notes indicated she was relocated to a summer residence for health and devotion. The bishop's letters suggest she was there alone. When Clarabella, you could not renounce your vows, you could not speak out because to speak was to sin. In the 17th century, convents across France used the term voto perpetuo, perpetual vow, to signify complete erasure of self-will. The church framed this as freedom from earthly temptation. But for many women, it meant the end of personhood. One letter from a Venetian nun reads, "I have not seen my own face in 20 years. Mirrors are forbidden, so is laughter. I am told this is liberation. It feels like stone." Brides of Christ, yes, but brides who had no wedding day, no voice, no way out. They were sanctified, sacrificed, and archived like property in the name of God. The scandal the church couldn't bury. By the 19th century, the church had survived empires, revolutions, and reformations. But in 1862, a single woman nearly shattered its silence. Her name was Princess Katharina von Hohenlohe, an aristocratic widow from Germany. Wealthy, devout, and politically connected, she entered the Sant'Ambrogio convent in Rome, seeking peace, penance, and spiritual sisterhood. Instead, she uncovered a nightmare. Within weeks, Katharina began to suspect that something was deeply wrong. Nuns whispered in the halls at night. Confessors met women privately for hours, sometimes behind locked doors. Drugs were passed under the guise of holy medicine. Then came the visions. The abbess claimed to see the Virgin Mary in the corridors. She gave out ashes that burned the skin. She ordered punishments without cause and praised ecstasies that left nuns moaning in pain. Caterina was skeptical. She refused the concoctions. She questioned the confessions. And that's when they tried to kill her. She lay. Testified that a nun named Maria Luisa, acting under the abbess's orders, attempted to poison her 3 times. First with food, then with powders. Finally with a tincture slipped into her communion wine. Caterina survived, barely, and used her noble status to alert the Inquisition. What followed was one of the most explosive church trials of the modern era. The investigation revealed priests having sexual relationships with multiple nuns, a secret inner circle of holy sisters who believed they were married to Christ in the flesh. Punishments including naked flagellation, isolation and forced drugging, letters and confessions that showed how the Pope's inner circle had known for years and done nothing. The abbess, Maria Luisa, claimed she had been chosen by God to feel the Lord's love through earthly union, and that the priests were only conduits of divine affection. She was convicted of heresy and fraud, but not for the abuse. Why? Because the system wasn't built to protect women like Caterina, it was built to protect power. The trial ran from 1862 to 1865, held in the very heart of Catholicism, and yet it was buried almost immediately after. Documents were sealed, testimonies redacted. Only fragments survived in Inquisition archives, hidden in Vatican vaults for over a century. It wasn't until 2013 that historian Hubert Wolff accessed the full files and exposed the story in his groundbreaking book, The Nuns of Sant'Ambrogio. What he found wasn't just corruption, it was systemic rot, wrapped in incense and old, because this wasn't some medieval tale. It happened in modern Europe, in a church that still claims moral authority over hundreds but behind that image lies a truth so disturbing, the church did everything to forget it. Most of the women who lived through these abuses, the nuns who were assaulted, drugged, impregnated and silenced, are nameless. Their records were destroyed, their letters burned, their stories buried beneath layers of doctrine, denial and dust. Even today, many convent archives remain locked to scholars. Entire periods of monastic life, missing. Whole generations of women erased from history as if they never existed. Why? Because their pain threatens the myth. The myth that the church, in its purity, its celibacy, its divine hierarchy, was ever infallible. To protect that myth, women's voices were silenced, not just in life, but in death. Convents across Europe were renovated, demolished, or converted into museums. The bodies of infants buried in their gardens were never exhumed. The testimonies of victims, even when documented, were labeled hysteria, heresy, or hallucination, but not all traces vanished. Inquisition transcripts, smuggled letters, medical records, and unearthed remains tell a different story, one not of holiness, but of horror. These were not isolated incidents, they were patterns, a system where spiritual vows became weapons, where obedience was twisted into submission, where God's house became a prison. And yet, despite the silence, some women fought back. Princess Caterina testified, marginalized historians preserved convent records, and survivors, anonymous though they remain, left behind the evidence of their resistance, bruises, births, and whispers between walls. This section of history was never taught in schools, never preached from pulpits, because it doesn't fit into the clean narrative of sainthood and sacrifice. But it matters, because when institutions demand silence, we must remember the ones they tried to erase. Because when the powerful twist faith into control, we must listen to the voices they buried. Because behind every stained glass window there may be a woman screaming, unheard, unseen, forgotten. These women were not just brides of Christ, they were daughters, sisters, mothers, robbed of choice, of voice, of history. We cannot give them justice, but we can give them remembrance. We can say, "You were not alone. We see you now. We remember